I'm really touched to be here, actually. It feels really good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm trying not to shout. You know, like a couple of years ago, I used to do lectures, like, sort of, I'm doing it already. I sort of wander around like a confused ape, you know. And I used to do these lectures like sort of John Lydon speed, you know. And I realised after a while that that's not Tim, that's John Lydon. Or Slavoj Žižek, actually. I was trying to copy Slavoj Žižek. And because he nicked my idea. So I thought, if I copy the way he talks, maybe it'll be like reverse mojo or something. Then I realised that's not what I actually like, you know. So luckily for you, I get to talk a bit more normal, you know. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for inviting me, and I'm very honoured to be here, and I'm very touched to be here. And I decided in this talk I wasn't going to say anything about art in particular, because y'all, as they say where I live, do that. You know, so it would be odd for me to kind of be like, and this is what you should be doing now, you know. So I'm going to give you a sort of picture that I'm doodling a lot these days. And it's for this book that I'm doing. It's my new project. Funnily enough, it's called Dark Ecology. And I've been trying to write this book for about 5 years, you know. The first version or two were just like outtakes from other stuff, you know. So that was wrong. And then maybe version 3 was like setting myself up too much. You know, like, this has to be the most important thing you've ever done. Nothing else matters apart from this, you know. And also, you need to do pure thought, you know. It needs to be just inevitable, glacial logic with no, like, actual, you know, Timbo feelings in it, or whatever. And no examples. So where did I get that from? You know, it's like depression space kind of pushing me. So I thought, so that was whack, you know, and I gave that up. And now I'm doing it. I've got my thing together a bit more about how to do it. Funnily enough, a lot of the project is very musical. Like, the way I'm writing it has a lot of kind of cadence to it and some kind of rhythm. And there was a lot of visual art in hyperobjects for some reason. For no particular reason, it's just that a lot of visual artists started sending me stuff. And is this hyperobjects? Is this dark ecology kind of? And then I got interested in, you know, because I like supporting people. And so I've been planning, actually, to do some kind of project. I don't know what it is yet. Minnesota Press is interested in it, and other people are interested in it. Columbia is going to publish the book, I think. But I wanted to do some kind of music thing, you know, like some kind of album, you know. So I'd hope maybe we can talk about that, because I'm working with some artists like Holly Herndon, you know, Susie Poling. There's a bunch of people from Mills College who are interested in putting some stuff together. DJ Spooky might do something or not about dark ecology, who knows, and so on and so on. So, you know, and I come from a family of musicians, and you know, music is a heavy duty for me, you know. That's why I'm an English professor, yeah, because it's too much, you know. So hopefully I don't die in the next couple of days, right? But if I do, it'll be very happy. So, you know. And I was also thinking, from what Aria was saying, I come from Houston, yeah, which is unbelievable. I can't believe I say that. I'm from Texas, you know? But I am, right now. And it occurred to me, I love this climate. It's so dry and cold and kind of autumnally burning, sparkly, you know, but like, Houston is hot and wet, which is my second favourite you know. And funnily enough, in a way, Houston is the Nickel of America. You know, actually, the southern, sort of to the south of that, this town called Galveston, all the oil refineries and processing plants are about 20 minutes drive from where I live, right? So it's not unlike what we're going to be up to, you know. So funnily enough, it's like, come to this place, it's exactly like where you live, only it's really cold. And the other thing about it, when I was hearing Ari's very brilliant introduction, I was thinking the key word is explicit, right? Houston is a really explicit town. People are very explicit with their speech, right? But also, the infrastructure that Ari was mentioning, that's often so hidden, you know, is really in view. I mean, oil pipes, normally people like to hide them, don't they? You know, but you know, like how airports have normally got like some model of a plane or whatever in the front of them. We've got an oil pipe, you know, and the question is it for real? Like, it could be a real actual oil pipe, because that's kind of how they roll, you know. Very, very handy, you know. And you look outside and you see the wires and the cables and the electricity stuff, because it's all like put together out of bits of sellotape and stuff, because they don't believe in big government, you know, so you can see it. It's the really deconstructed town, you know, so the kind of art that's trying to reveal the infrastructure is almost irrelevant in a place like this and in a place like Houston, you know, like there are these artists obviously in LA, the land use something, I can never remember. Centre for Land Use, right? Yeah? Centre for Land Interpretation? Land Use and Research, yes, I can never remember their name. This environmental group that I'm in at the school, Rice, was like, let's invite them over because they'll be able to show us all the amazing things. But I'm like, but you just have to look out of your window. I mean, all they have to do is point, like, look, there, see the devilish underpinnings of your world, you know. Explicit, yeah. So this talk is called Human Thought at Earth Magnitude, and it's because my friend Douglas Kahn, who some of you probably know, recently invented this phrase, Earth Magnitude, and I thought, wow, that's such a beautiful... I have to say this phrase now every other minute, because it's so good, Earth Magnitude, yeah? Wow. When we scale up to Earth Magnitude, very interesting things happen to thinking. Far from making supposed universalistic generalisations, as many still assume ecological statements to be, thought at Earth magnitude is highly accurate and specific. Yet it's also deeply entwined with paradox in such a way that it reveals something basic to the structure of thought. A loop form, which I take to be the structure of being anything at all, a logical system, a solar ray, an electromagnetic shield, an aurora, an oil refinery. Moreover, Earth magnitude is the correct scale on which to think something seemingly near to us, yet in fact far more distant than Sagittarius A, the Milky Way black hole, right? This thing that's far more distant is human being, as such. I take Earth magnitude to mean at a scale sufficient to open the concept Earth to the true extent of its range. Solar winds do this as they interact with Earth's magnetic shield. They produce auroras. Global climate does this, as the mass of terrestrial weather events are downwardly caused by a massive entity that exists at Earth magnitude. Human thought at Earth magnitude is human thinking that is as large as the aurora. Namely, it's a thought that can think the aurora in such a way that its vastness is witnessed and opened in us. Of course, a single person can do this on the ground. You don't need to be a geostationary satellite or a scientist or an astronaut. It's easy to see how thinking the aurora is thought at Earth magnitude. We shall see that it's quite tricky with what I take to be the most provocative thing about the Anthropocene. with its mass extinction, namely the fact that we can now think species fully, precisely not as a thing we can point to, but as something like the aurora, a mysterious yet distinct, sparkling entity. It seems superficially so easy. Look, I'm a human, not a duck or a donut. But this superficial sense of ease is blocking something stupendously difficult. That is that human thought follows and witnesses the being owing to which thinking is happening. Thinking goes into a loop, and the loop could be endless or not, we don't know yet. And the thinking becomes a weird openness to things, far from cataloguing and classifying. This being is further from thought than Sagittarius A, the black hole in the centre of the Milky Way galaxy. The Anthropocene is a deeply anti-anthropocentric concept, because it enables us to think the human species not as an ontically given thing I can point to, but as a hyper-object that is real yet inaccessible. There is a problem with some forms of Marxism. Okay, don't shoot me yet. Okay. Now, talking of explicit, I'm actually becoming a bit more explicit about it, because I'm getting older and more, whatever, cocky, maybe, or something. There is a problem with some forms of Marxism, notably the kind of cultural Marxism that seems to have been slightly going after me quite recently. Oh, it's revenge. That's the motivation. Right? That seems to have been slightly going after me quite recently. The problem is very simple to state. It's some kind of implicit anthropocentrism. This anthropocentrism does indeed pick up on a theme in Marx's own thought. Marx himself was happy to write about things that were outside the human sphere and about things outside the sphere of capital, but there is this anthropocentric strain. Marx writes that the best of bees is always worse than the worst of architects. That's because the architect is imagining her or his building and the bee is just executing an algorithm. Well, prove it. We could go about this two ways. We could set up lots of expensive experiments to find out whether bees imagined things. Of course, we'd have to know what we were looking for, namely empirical evidence of imagination. For instance, we could set up an experiment to see whether bees hesitated. If they hesitated and circumspected in some sense while they were carrying out a task, that might be evidence that they weren't just blindly following an algorithm. By the way, so defensive can some Marxists get about this bit in Marx, they do perhaps sense the danger at this point, that they sometimes tell me this passage is just metaphorical, that by bees Marx really means workers, and architects Marx really means the bourgeoisie. But wait, isn't that a bit more insulting? To humans as well as to bees? I mean, now Marx is now saying that workers just blindly execute. How on earth are these poor, very crude androids going to figure out what's going on and start a revolution, which depends upon a goodly slice of imagination? Anyway, back to our experiment. Now, in fact, this kind of experiment has been done on ants. It's been shown that ants, while climbing up little ladders, look around them rather than walking up automatically. They weigh options when it comes to where to live and so on. This suggests that ants anticipate and assess situations, which is at least part of what architects are supposed to be doing when they design a building. It's also been shown that bees build mental maps to find their way home. They aren't just on autopilot. And rats experience regret, and so on and so on. The trouble is, our poor scientist has to know roughly what she's looking for already before running the experiment. And this means that she is forever haunted by a deep problem that affects both science and humanities in the Anthropocene, that is to say, the age of Hume. By which I mean the age in which there is no objectified, obvious cause and effect churning away below phenomena, like cogwheels. Which means that cause and effect are inferences we make concerning statistical correlations in data. Which is why scientists have to say, well, we're 95% sure that it's happening, which is better than saying, it is happening, and if you don't believe me, I'm going to have to send the Spanish Inquisition, you know. But anyway, cause and effect are in front of things, not behind them, in front, ontologically, if you see what I mean. Which is why I like to talk about how causality is really part of the aesthetic dimension, a fact that seems quite clear, though still weird, in a post-Newtonian world. Which means that scientists are now beginning to figure out something we've known in the humanities and arts for ages, namely that you are entangled in what you're seeing. After all, this is basic Kant, who grounded Hume's insight about causality in just this thought, which we now call correlationism. We can't see things in themselves, we can see human-flavoured correlates of those things, but there are things in themselves. So we're caught in a dilemma. The name for this dilemma is hermeneutic circle. Scientists now call it confirmation bias, which is why only a small percentage of physicists now think that physics is saying anything true at all about reality. They are suddenly freaked out by a basic implication of Hume that they've been blocking for 200 years. Of course, the term confirmation bias is itself a symptom of some kind of confirmation bias, because it suggests that there are things over there and that there are interpretations over here, and that those interpretations can therefore be biased. But this idea of objects over there and subjects over here is precisely what correlationism and its consequent hermeneutic circle is saying is impossible. Or rather, that it's a metaphysical factoid that you've smuggled into your view pre-theoretically. Never mind that Kant himself had smuggled in this view, which is the old Aristotelian, and I would argue agricultural, picture of bland substances decorated with accidents. That's exactly why we can't assume, that's exactly what we can't assume things are like. It's the kind of thing that gives rise to ideas that bees are just blind robots, while architects are gravity-defying subjects. Heaven help us, we would never ever want to be denigrated to the status of a thing, because all we know in advance, because we all know in advance that things are lumps. That's one reason why OOO has come in for lots of criticism. By saying object, we are touching this third rail. And behind that, there is an even more sensitive third rail of beliefs about what entities are. Sensitive because of its political implications. Sensitive because those beliefs are now hardwired into Earth's surface in a way so effective that millions of life forms are now going extinct in the 6th mass extinction. Just last week or so, the World Wildlife Fund revealed that 50% of animals have now disappeared in the last 40 years. Noticing that is horribly uncanny, and we want to go on dreaming because it feels safer, and it's a 12,000-year dream. Talking of dreams, I need the elixir of life. The lack of obvious empirical evidence concerning imagination points to a much more efficient and much cheaper way of proving whether or not the best of bees is always worse than the worst of architects. What do we have already? We already have some sense that bees and ants can do things with their very limited, according to our prejudice, tiny brains that look like things that we can do. So by inference, we aren't as special as we thought. But we can go one step behind this and think about the actual, really obvious state of affairs, which is that we lack reliable evidence for imagination. Now, I'm not saying there is no imagination, far from it, actually. I'm not one of those people, because that's kind of religion, actually, thinking, there is no, it's all just matter, or it's all just nothing, right? That's always number one in the charts, isn't it, you know, right now. What I'm saying is, prove that the architect has imagination. Prove it. Prove that I have imagination as a human being. Prove that I'm not executing an algorithm. More to the point, prove that my idea that I'm not executing an algorithm is just the kind of algorithm that I've been programmed to execute. Being paranoid that I might not be a person is in fact a default condition of being a person. In other words, we have a profound philosophical hesitation here. It's so stimulating that usually we like to collapse the duality into one of its terms. For instance, we could decide that there is no imagination, that we are totally conditioned, a thought that is usually close to reducing things to matter. Thoughts are functions of brains and so on. Or we could say that there is personhood and that it's totally different from being a determined machine. We could perhaps back this up with some idea of mental qualia or the irreducibility of consciousness. What's interesting is that we are trying to get rid of a profound wonderment. And since I take wonderment to be the basic phenomenological chemical of philosophy, as Plato does, we are implicitly trying to shut down philosophy when we take this path, either way. Right? The point being, when it comes to bees and humans, prove that I, the human, am imagining. Prove it. If you have some hesitation or difficulty doing so, that's fantastic. It means that you have accepted modern science, which means you have accepted modern philosophy since the start of the Anthropocene. Yay! And if you try not to collapse the hesitation, like the hesitation of an ant on a tiny ladder, that's even better. It means you have accepted the deep reason for the validity of modern science and philosophy. You have not collapsed the wonderment. You are beginning the difficult upgrade of concepts, such as person and thing, so essential to human thought in an ecological age, and indeed so essential for the continued existence of life forms. In short, you are beginning to think at Earth magnitude. I could just stop there, right? But there's another 10 pages, so whatever. But that was good, yeah, as an ending. Silly me, there's a bit more. At Earth magnitude, anthropocentric distinctions don't matter anymore. Or better, they cease to be thin and rigid. They matter differently, amazingly differently. These distinctions include binaries such as here versus there, person versus thing, individual versus group, conscious versus unconscious, sentient versus non-sentient, life versus non-life, and even existing versus non-existence. Take evolution science. Quite quickly after biology was established as a scientific discipline, the problem with life as such began to raise its head, such that the life-non-life boundary became not exactly erased, but far from thin and rigid. The same happens to sentience, consciousness, and in the ecological age, between the human and the non-human altogether, notably such that ideas like world and here begin to look not like big abstract concepts, but rather small, localized, human-flavored. Not that there is no such thing as place. The very idea that space is the real one, because it's just abstract extension, is the one that begins to melt. We begin to see that it's based on a rather anthropocentric viewpoint in all sorts of ways. Euclidean space, for instance, is really a good enough human scale way to describe motion. So in evolution science, you can't look at a duck and see what it's for in some obviously human-flavoured way. Ducks aren't for anything. Ducks aren't for swimming, and Greeks aren't for enslaving barbarians. Sorry, Aristotle. Teleology is gone. It has evaporated. Hierarchies have collapsed, but there are still ducks, and humans, and earth, and sentience, and life forms as opposed to salt crystals. They become more and more vivid as our ways of distinguishing them become more and more questionable. This isn't what we were expecting. We were expecting, perhaps, that once we could see on a much larger scale, things would become much easier to understand. Indeed, we might criticise those who tried to think at larger scales for being simplistic. We might even argue that they were deluded, particularly if we had quite a bad case of the anthropocentric blues. We might accuse someone, this is just personal venting, isn't it? We might accuse someone, if we were a certain kind of Marxist, of being a bit of a hippie, for talking at scales bigger or otherwise beyond the human. The hippie is ideologically deluded into saying things exist outside of social ideological mediation based on the state of the forces of production. In short, all that we are the world stuff and save the earth stuff is bourgeois pabulum meant to keep us docile. Why does our Marxist have this allergic reaction? Sorry, recorder. Why does our Marxist have this allergic reaction? Because he is rigidly adhering to a solution to the Kantian shock. The shock that there are things, but when we look for them, we only find human-flavoured thing data. We never see the actual raindrop. We have raindrop feelings, raindrop thoughts, raindrop perceptions. Kant himself tries to contain the explosion by saying that there is a top-level way of understanding the raindrop, namely mathematising it via a concept of extension as the bedrock of what a thing is. Post-Kantians contain the explosion two ways. Either they reduce everything to matter and ignore the implications of modern philosophy and the science derived from it, or they wish away the gap between phenomenon and thing by claiming more strongly than Kant that some kind of decider, goo-goo-goo-joob, makes the thing real. They sort of reduce it upwards. So all these powerful substitutes for the Kantian subject arise: Geist, Hegel, will, Schopenhauer, will to power, Nietzsche, Dasein, Heidegger, and we all know German Dasein is the best decider of all. And in the case of Marx, thank you for laughing, and in the case of Marx, thank you, and in the case of Marx, human economic relations. Human economic relations make things real. And in the hardcore Hegelian, Lacanian, Althusserian version, these relations are an in the last instance that determine everything else, like the sucker of a giant and sprawling undersea creature attached to a rock in one place, but attached really strongly, incapable of being peeled off that rock. So that for the cultural Marxist, unconsciously retweeting a substance-accidents model of things, there is ideology, accidents, and human economic relations, substance. Of course, putting it this way, I have already committed a horrible sin because I've said the word human. By saying that word, I have implied that there might be a world or worlds beyond or different than the human, which is as good as saying as such that there are such worlds. I have touched the third rail. I have implied Marxism doesn't explain everything, because there are cats, coral, and galaxies. The very concept ecology, coined by Ernst Haeckel, was a way to say the economy of nature in a compact way. The economy of nature, economic relations that include non-humans, highly suspicious. And humiliating, because it now means that claims to geopolitical whateverness aside, geopolitical being a term that is often used in certain forms of Marxism, what Marxism can't think precisely is the geopolitical. Oh dear. The very thing Marxism, like Hegel and Nietzsche, claims to do, namely to think everything sufficiently, is exactly what it can't do. It can't think at earth magnitude. So cultural Marxism lets fly a whole bunch of accusations against the sinners. They are some kind of racist, or sexist, or colonialist, because they use concepts such as species. This is because species, in the non-teleological sense, and claims to think species being notwithstanding, is precisely what Marxism can't think. This is despite Marx's grounding in Feuerbach, whose whole project was to show that species was not an abstract universalistic generalisation, but a finite, concrete entity, though at a much larger scale than we normally think beings. And in an ecological age, a necessary scale, because aside from being Tim Morton, and aside from thinking that I'm a human being, I am actually a member of a species, Homo sapiens, that has actually destroyed Earth, this actual species, not lizards or fruit bats. Species being, in the end, unfortunately, is another teleological concept in the lineage of Aristotle. Humans produce, which means they imagine, unlike bees, which I suspect which, rather than who, for the users of this concept, are just robots. And robots are just things. And things are inanimate, unconscious lumps of whatever, decorated with accidents. So Dipesh Chakrabarty, the historian who writes about global warming, and I, now get into a lot of trouble with certain journals because we say the word species, among other words. What is it like to think species at Earth magnitude? If species isn't obviously humans as I see them, I can point to them, they're constantly present, I know in advance what they are, and so on and so on. In other words, what is it like to think species as a hyperobject? Since it's the notion of hyperobject that provides a way to think entities at Earth magnitude, hyperobjects being real entities that cannot be seen or touched or otherwise grasped, and yet we can think them. They are beyond the human, but they aren't infinite or abstract. They are just really, really big. This thought, thinking the human at Earth magnitude, is utterly uncanny, strangely familiar, and familiarly strange. It is as if I realise that I am a zombie, or better, that I'm actually a component of a zombie without my will. Every time I start my car, I'm not meaning personally to destroy life forms, which is what destroying Earth actually means. Nor does my action have any statistical meaning whatsoever. And yet, mysteriously and disturbingly, scaled up to Earth magnitude so that there are billions of hands that are turning billions of ignitions in billions of starting engines every few minutes, the sixth mass extinction event is precisely what is being caused. Whether I'm thinking this thought or not, whether I mean to or not, even whether or not I start my own personal car. So back to the question, am I conscious? Prove that I'm not better than the best of bees. Prove that I am better than the best of bees. Prove that my idea of consciousness, let alone individual free will, isn't just the kind of algorithm that my particular species has evolved to run. The species thought, stripped of its metaphysical, easy to identify, soothingly teleological content, is precisely an uncanny thought that happens not in some universal or infinite realm, but at Earth magnitude. It is strictly uncanny, in the Freudian sense, if we recall that Freud argues that uncanny feelings, in the end, involve the repressed intimacy of the mother's body, the uterus and the vagina out of which you came. This is very significant for us because thinking this mother's body at Earth magnitude means precisely thinking ecological embodiment and interdependence. That uterus is not just a symbol of the biosphere, nor is it even an indexical sign of the biosphere pointing to it like a footprint or a car indicator. The uterus is the biosphere in one of its manifold forms, just as me turning the key in the ignition is the human in one of its manifold forms. It is and it isn't, which is how you can tell it's real. To be real is to be contradictory, to be a member of a set that doesn't include you. To be real is not to be easy to identify, easy to think, metaphysically constantly present. Freud gets to this idea of the mother's body by thinking how the uncanny is excited when the seemingly rigid boundaries between life and non-life, or between sentience and non-sentience, become confused. Is an android alive? Am I alive? Is an android sentient? Am I sentient? This paranoia is evidence of being physically embodied in an irreducible way. Descartes, before he assures himself that God couldn't possibly pull such a stunt, he is paranoid that he might just be the puppet of a demon. Being a person means being concerned, as I said, that you might not be a person. Because there you are, pre-theoretically, in Descartes' case, sitting by a fire and holding a piece of paper in your hand. That's the first sentence of meditation. So I'm sitting by the fire holding this piece of paper in my hand. And being embodied means being the biosphere, in the same way as the uterus and the hand turning the key are the biosphere. Being it and not being it. Ecological awareness is uncanny like that. Freud thinks of being lost in a forest, which is also a Cure song, fantastic, and returning again and again to the same spot, like someone in the Blair Witch Project or a Cure song. This being lost is already sexualized in a misogynistic way, because the previous example in the very same paragraph is about being lost in a red light district, trying to exit and coming back again and again to see the prostitutes, described by Freud somewhere between life and non-life, puppets in a window who look at you and ask you to buy them. We could go on a huge digression now about how all of consumer society is something like animistic, but I won't. Realising we are on Earth in the full Earth magnitude way, realising that we are permanently phenomenologically glued to Earth, even if we go to Mars, realising that we are covered and brimful of skin, pollution, stomach bacteria, DNA from other life forms, vestigial organs, realising all this is an experience of the uncanny. trying to strip it away, and then you're doing exactly what caused the ecological disaster in the first place. Since 10,000 BC, trying to come up with one antibacterial soap to rule them all. One extreme symptom would be Nazism, trying to peel the abject embodiment off oneself once and for all. Or you can become excited about the uncanny. You can get stuck there. You can revel in pointing it out over and over, if you're a Slovenian philosopher. You can get stuck in the uncanny because of the predominance of misogyny. Like Freud and any number of speculative realist horror philosophers, or the world's greatest Hitchcockian Lacanian, you can juice yourself over and over again with this uncanniness. It's addicting. If you stay there, it means you aren't really acknowledging the depth of ecological awareness, because one's mother's body isn't some abject, disgusting thing from which one must tear oneself philosophically, even though birth involves tearing and fluids and pain on all sides. One mother's body is the biosphere. Under the disgust and the horrific uncanny is a kind of melancholia, another Freudian term pointing to the indigestible physical and psychic memory trace of other beings within oneself. Indigestible because there is no one antibacterial soap to rule them all. Once you think you've gotten rid of one, along comes another, like the heads of the many-headed hydra. So you can get stuck in tragedy, like Wagner and the Nazis, the tragedy of realising that trying to escape the web of fate is the web of fate. And within the melancholia is an unconditional sadness. And within the sadness is beauty. And within the beauty is longing. And within the longing is a plasma field of joy. This is Dark Ecology, yeah? To me, right? This is the real reason why I was blocked about writing it, was that I was also on this trip of like, oh, it's really dark and depressing, and like, oh, it's exciting and evil, and oh, it's really bad. Then realising there's a few more levels below, right? You haven't hit the subfloor, basement, when you go to that place, you know. Dark is first of all depressing, right? Then it's strange and weird, and then inside that it's really sweet, you know, like dark chocolate, sugar, right? It's like that, right? But you get to the sweetness through the sadness, down that way, right? So now I can write it. Laughter inside tragedy. Comedy, the possibility space of which tragedy is a rare form. Comedy, the form of coexistence. One's uterus or one's stomach are finite, and insofar as they are finite, they exist. To exist is to be finite, which is to be incomplete. In this I am the absolute opposite of Badiou, who insists that to exist is to be consistent. For me to exist is to be fragile, because you're never complete. To be a biosphere, then, is to be fragile, incomplete, inconsistent, and finite. It's the same with species. These are just very large objects, thought at Earth magnitude, but they don't go on forever. There is weirdly less of everything than we might suppose. We don't need to be holists and think that biospheres are more than the sum of their parts. That would be awful. That would mean that the parts of a biosphere are replaceable components, so never mind about the mass extinction event. Instead, it's much better and more accurate to think of it this way. A biosphere is a set of things that aren't it. A frog, a glass of milk, thoughts about biospheres, a blade of grass in a meadow. To appreciate biospheres and frogs and blades of grass, not to mention sounds, thoughts and political systems, we need to allow things to be contradictory, which is, in set theoretical terms, means allowing sets to contain things that aren't members of them. We can take some comfort in the fact that the attempt to smooth out logic to exclude things that contradict has never worked. This is because I intuit there is something about reality that is also contradictory, namely, there is something about being a thing at all that involves deep, intrinsic contradiction. It has been convincingly shown that to be true on its own terms, a logical system must be able to talk nonsense, including a logical system that has excluded explicitly any kind of nonsense on its terms from being spoken. Indeed, the more efficient at it the logical system gets, the worse nonsense it can speak, which is uncannily, but not accidentally, I feel, exactly the same as how to breed superbugs by washing with stronger and stronger antibiotic soaps, or how to start global warming by trying to avoid global warming, which is like the geological time history of the last 12,000 years condensed into a single handy phrase. Turing proved Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which I've just paraphrased, by imagining a physical machine that could process algorithms by reading tape. No such machine could be programmed so as to predict when every single other Turing machine would go into an infinite loop or not. Since Turing's proof involves physical objects, again I think there is an uncanny pointer here to actual physical objects, such as plutonium and quasars. To exist is to be capable of dissembling, of appearing otherwise than you are, and yet to be none other than you are, to be tricksy. Thought at earth magnitude reveals itself also to be a trickster. Thought itself goes into a loop, or rather its loop form becomes incredibly obvious, even if you aren't a Gnostic. Jnana or yeshe or gnosis means a kind of knowing that is intrinsic, knowing all by itself, a sort of non-human knowing that is just happening without me willing it. This knowing knows itself as one of the beings that it knows. It is thought in a loop, or as a scholar of Gnosticism puts it, thought having sex with itself. This is fantastic, because it means that within the structure of thought itself is the strange strangeness, the otherness, the non-you entityness that we also find unconditionally in the beauty experience. We don't need endless empirical evidence to prove that something other than me exists. We just need a thought that seems to many like narcissism, because it is. What we need is an upgrade of how we think narcissism. Because in the end, caring for the self is erotically caring for the other in what could become an ever-expanding circle, or better spiral, of erotic care for all beings. So no, thought at earth magnitude is not grown-up thought that has accepted some pre-formatted reality principle and finally sees what pathetic small idiots we are. You know, with full respect to the opening of Nietzsche's On Truth and Lying in a non-moral sense. And Ray Brazier. Thought at earth magnitude sees the cosmic joke that things like Earths and biospheres and species are also toy-like, namely incomplete entities that could evaporate under their own steam, let alone something else's. Indeed, how they cease to exist is when one form of appearance, say a sound wave of sufficient amplitude and frequency, interferes with the way they appear, such that the rift between what they are and how they appear, an invisible and irreducible rift, gets weirdly wider and wider until all you are left with are appearances, memories, some flowers in a jar, a leftover piece of sandwich, or in the classic experiment of opera singer versus glass, fragments of glass, physical glass memories, a glass only legible in the tiny chips that are strewn all over the floor. Even black holes evaporate. So thought at earth magnitude cannot possibly involve contempt or cynicism. It must instead involve a caring sense of hypocrisy, a compassionate laughter that one can never ever get the ecological recipe just right so as to save all life forms all at once, all the time. Because very simply, if you're being nice to the bunny rabbits, it means you're not being nice to the bunny rabbit parasites. Something is always missing from the ethical and political jigsaw, because something is always missing from the ontological jigsaw. So peel yourself off the floor and start to smile. Thank you.